when I was originally drafting this, or when I was originally planning the book, this was going to be a few pages in the introduction on the historiography. Then I realized that was impossible, and I realized, in fact, makes at least to my mind, a very interesting intellectual history of thinking about this question. With lots of political, social, cultural developments influencing the way history writing on this topic developed. And I divided into various periods and various trends. To summarize some of it, I'll say that up until the 1990s, it would be very difficult to make sense out of what occurred between Ukrainian nationalists and Jews during the Second World War. And you had in Holocaust studies two trends. One, the early Holocaust studies, and it was continued later in Israel, particularly in Yad Vashem, was a trend to describe the experiences of these Ukrainian Jews written by people who actually came from these regions, who knew these languages, who knew these territories, who were very interested, though, in Jewish history. And they were limited in that way. And they knew that Ukrainian nationalists, Oun and Upa, both, had done terrible things. But they didn't know much about Oun and Upa. And they tried to find out. So like Philip Friedman, one of the founders of Holocaust studies, corresponds with Lev Shankovsky, the Ukrainian military historian, to try to find out more. He writes to other survivors to find out more, but they can't really find out much. And that's because the literature that's written by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and its veterans omits the topic. For example, Herasimenko writes a book on the Melnik faction during World War II, their activities, in which Jews are not mentioned at all, and the Holocaust is not mentioned at all. How you write a book about World War II in Ukraine without mentioning this, I don't know. But he managed well, and others did the same thing. Or in my paper, I also show Lev Shankovsky, with whom I say Friedman corresponded. I show how he didn't tell the truth about OUN activities in the South, and that in fact OUN was promoting anti-Semitism in the area. And I can take that from actual OUN proclamations that were given at that time. Anyway, so they couldn't find out. The Jewish scholars who were interested in OUN, they couldn't find out anything about it. And then there was another problem in Holocaust studies, which was that Hilberg decided, he wrote this magisterial work, The Destruction of the European Jews, which became the classic kind of field-shaping study in which he relied entirely on German documentation. Unlike the Jewish historians, he wouldn't even look at eyewitness testimony. Hannah Arendt felt exactly the same way. She came out of exactly the same kind of experience as he did. And as a result, they were only interested in what the Germans did, and what the Germans said was all true, because they admitted so much of what they were doing. So this also made it impossible to find out. Holocaust studies, mainstream Holocaust studies in the West, did not know anything about Eastern Europe. And Hilberg himself, when he writes, he has Eastern European stereotypes. He mentions OUN once. He calls it a pro-German organization. And in the index, he can't even tell you that it stands for Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So, and all those who followed after him relied on what the Germans had to say. Even the classic, I would say, after Hilberg is Browning, right? and second sort of man in the field. And he writes about a reserve German police battalion that goes through Poland murdering Jews and others and uses no Polish sources.
And no Jewish sources.
Or Jewish sources, yes. So up until the 1990s, you couldn't really do anything. 1990s are very important. 1990s witnessed the collapse of communism, and with it, most people say, well, yes, the archives are opened. And that's extremely important, that the archives are opened, because all of a sudden, we have access to way more German documents than we ever had before. But more than that, we have lots of OUN and UPA documents that had never been seen before. Even recently, for example, a milk can was found just last year full of genuine UPA documents. So, and the Soviet archives could be opened, but there's more happened than that. It's not just the archives opened. All of a sudden, you could talk about these things, which hadn't been possible earlier. So this had many ramifications. Not only could Ukrainian historians begin talking about these things, but Polish historians could as well, because prior to the 1990s, Polish historians were not allowed to write about what happened in Volhynia. They could write about what happened in the Carpathian Mountains, but they couldn't write about territories which were in Soviet Ukraine. Now, all of a sudden, you got the collection of Polish testimonies on UPA violence against the Poles, which came out in a number of collections, but particularly by the Siemaszkos. And this became a topic that became more open. Even OUN and UPA veterans began to write much more openly about their past, which they were afraid to do before the 1990s because their relatives could be hurt in the old country, so they wouldn't reveal names. They were reticent. They didn't come out and talk about their participation in the Holocaust too much, although you find some. But mostly what was important was now they fleshed out so many more details about who was in OUN, who was in UPA, what they were doing, what were their roles. So we learned so much more as a result of this, and it became an issue in Ukraine. People in Ukraine in the more nationalist movements were calling for the rehabilitation of OUN and UPA and for giving UPA veterans the same rights as veterans of the Red Army. So the 1990s opened new opportunities, new archives. Just briefly, I'll mention two works that I think, because in the 1990s there was no consensus at all. It's always just brand new and opening. And one work I'll mention is Dieter Paul's detailed German study, big, thick. You could use it to make a bookcase out of. It's like a big cinder block.
You said German length study.
A German length study, yes, a German length study. Yeah. And he, though, under the impact of the traditions of Holocaust scholarship, again discounted eyewitness testimony and relied on the German documents. But he had lots more German documents, and he had OUN UPA documents, which he used. But he could come to no clear conclusion about what was the role of OUN and UPA in relation to the Holocaust. But another book that came out in that same year, same period, was a very interesting Ukrainian work by a woman called Jana Kolba, Ludzie Nistu Bezodni Pekla, Humaneness in the Abyss of Hell, which is very interesting because she's biased, very biased. She wants to get rid of the bias that Ukrainians are anti-Semites, and she wants to get rid of the bias that Jews were pro-communist, evil, sort of exploiters. So all her evidence, she sort of pushes in that direction. The Poles are the real anti-Semites, not the Ukrainians. We all know those kind of things. But she doesn't really get the situation. She doesn't know how to deal with it. She doesn't know how to reconcile with it. And reading that book, you get the feeling that for the first time the Holocaust is really being discussed in Ukraine. And the recognition of the special Jewish suffering is being brought to public attention.
2 minutes, John Paul, 2 minutes?
2 minutes? Yeah. And at the same time, the Ukrainian suffering, the repression of O'un and Upa after the war. 2001, 2000, I say there's a revolution in the mindset, and that's through Jan Grossa's work, which restores eyewitness testimony as important, which means that you have to actually know East European history. You can't just parachute intellectually into Eastern Europe and write up a thing. And he turns attention to this, what I call the microbiota of the organs. The same thing that Omer was talking about, the small actors. And then, of course, the last thing I'm just going to briefly mention is that there was a working group of historians in Soviet Ukraine who worked out some principles that led to the rehabilitation of O'un and Upa in the country, and it was headed by Stanislav Kulczycki. I joked I don't need a PowerPoint because I could just point to people in the audience. A very important thing to understand about them is they never mention Jews or the Holocaust in their work, at least not in their conclusions. But the reason for that is they were responding to a particular political conjuncture where the division in the country was between pro-communist, pro-Soviet, Red Army veterans, and the O'un, Upa veterans and sympathizers. And for the communists, the Holocaust was not an issue at all. They didn't ever sponsor research on it or anything. And that was not, the communists didn't object to that. They were worried about O'un, Upa as collaborators with the enemy, as traitors to the motherland, and that was the emphasis of the rehabilitation. So I'm going to stop there.